Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 14th of September. And what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about the textbook readings. If you'll remember last class, basically what we did was we reviewed the syllabus. I had indicated that I wanted to save the section about plagiarism to talk about today, so we will do that as well. And I left last class with asking you to introduce yourself to your classmates on the class discussion form. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses, my responses in turn as well. And as you can see, I responded to all of you. And you can think of this as kind of like class participation. You can decide how much or how little you want to participate in terms of your classmates. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself since you all shared a little bit about yourselves. For me, it begins in New York City, which is where I was born and raised. And I attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester. And I remember very clearly looking at those college catalogs, being so impressed with the school that indicated students attending that institution would experience, quote, real winters, unquote. Let's just say I was young and naive. A real winter can be very romantic. It can also be very challenging. There was a bit of both while I was there. And I'm majoring in English and minoring in psychology at the University of Rochester because I'm absolutely, positively certain I'm going to be a lawyer, which goes to show how your career goals can change and probably will change over the course of your academic career. I took a Shakespeare class that changed everything. I fell in love with Shakespeare and literature, decided that's really what I wanted to do with my career. So off I go to graduate school to study Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And I go to a school in a warm climate because I had had enough of those real winters. I settled on Southern California, UCLA to be exact. And they don't have winters. They do have mudslides and earthquakes, and the campus is surrounded by some of the most expensive real estate in the world that I wasn't aware of. But nevertheless, there I am at UCLA studying Shakespeare and his contemporaries. I finish up and I begin my teaching career. And I realize that at this point I'm ready to come, quote, home, unquote. And for me, that meant anything on the East Coast. So I started applying for positions, and there was a job opening at a small school I'd never heard of before, Greenfield Community College. So I guess you know how my story will end. I did apply for the position. I was very impressed that the community lived up to its name. It was a place with fields that were green. Where I lived, it was in the middle of drought in Southern California, and there were no green fields. So I was offered the position, which I accepted. And I remember very clearly what I was told by my interview committee. And they had said that the winters here in Massachusetts are, quote, not that bad, unquote. Now, I had some familiarity with Massachusetts through Boston, but I'd never been to Western Massachusetts previously. Well, I began at GCC in the 1993-94 academic year, a year that is actually historical because in that year, Massachusetts broke most of the existing records for cold, snow, and ice. It was a particularly brutal winter, and everyone was unprepared, especially me. But I've been here ever since, mostly teaching English classes, but obviously I teach personal communication skills as well, and I also teach some media classes. So that's a little bit of my story. And as we reviewed the syllabus, I had indicated that what I will be doing with class is posting the previous week in our past class folder section so that you can access the current week very easily on the front of our Moodle site. So if you wanted to see the notes from the past class session, you could just go to the past class sessions folder, which is in the upper section of our Moodle site under General. And what you can access today, in addition to this class video, is underneath the videos, I will always post the class notes. These are literally my notes that I use when I put forth classes. So it's what I would share with you, let's say on a whiteboard, for instance, if we were meeting face to face. I'm not using the online grading program, however. There's still enough of me that still relies on some paper. Obviously, you will get grades. And if you ever wanted to touch base with me about where you stand in the class, just please contact me and I'll be happy to give you some information. I also wanted to note that I received a message from the Wellness Center that I wanted to read to you. That Disability Services is in need of a volunteer note taker to assist a fellow student in this class. So you need to, if you decide to volunteer for something like this, is attend class, take reasonably good notes, and be willing to share your notes. Volunteers that share their notes for the entire semester will receive a $50 gift card to the bookstore at the ending of the semester. Shorter lengths of time will be prorated. And you can share your notes either through email or Google Drive if you're taking your notes on your computer, by scanning them or taking pictures of your notes if you're handwriting them, and sharing them via text, email, or Google Drive, or using a carbonless notepad, which could be provided by the Disability Services. So if you're willing to volunteer for this, please contact me as soon as possible, and then we'll make the necessary arrangements. First response is get the job. Thank you. So I wanted to move now to talk a little bit about plagiarism, which I had indicated I didn't have a chance to discuss last class. It used to be a fairly clear-cut conversation, and you can see in the section on the syllabus about plagiarism, I tried very hard not to plagiarize by giving credit. And that's basically how you avoid plagiarism, is that when you are using somebody else's language or their ideas, or both, that you make sure that you are giving that other person or entity credit. Without doing so, you're committing a kind of theft, whether deliberate or not. But rather than property theft, when you are stealing, let's say, in a retail store, you are, quote, stealing someone's intellectual property. And it's a pretty serious offense in academia. If you were to get off easy, so to speak, what would end up happening is that you would fail that assignment. But if you didn't get off easy, you could be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. And then I would tell 2 brief stories about plagiarism to try to encourage you not to plagiarize. The first actually occurred to me very early on in my academic career. So this would be pre-internet, which meant that I couldn't use resources to determine whether or not I was reading plagiarized work. As many resources that exist to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of resources, perhaps, to help teachers determine if they are plagiarizing. Turnitin.com is one of my favorites. You just kind of type in a sentence or a paragraph. It does an electronic search. Nevertheless, I didn't have access to any of that. I had to rely on my memory. And it wasn't too difficult, and it's pretty obvious, that teachers are well read, but I can't say that it was because I had a thorough background that I was able to recognize this passage. It's much more absurd than that. The passage was actually taken from an art class textbook, which I had assigned for the class, with a few mechanical errors here and there. I don't know if the person was just a sloppy plagiarist. Maybe it was that they were hopeful that if there were a few mechanical errors, I would be misled. That's one story. The better story did not occur to me, but it occurred around the same time, and it appeared in all the academic newspapers. Yeah, there is such a thing as academic newspapers. A middle-aged professor, that part's important that this professor be middle-aged, is reading a set of papers, and something sounds familiar. Again, because it's pre-internet, he has to rely on his memory, and he realizes after some thought he hadn't read this someplace before. He had written it himself decades earlier when he was an undergraduate student in college. I know the likelihood is almost nil, but it did occur, and it had something to do with the fraternity that was recycling old papers. So not only was the student caught plagiarizing, but also became a media sensation just because of the situation. And then I would pretty much encourage students not to plagiarize, especially with a class like public speaking, and especially in the first speech, because the first speech is about yourself. And that would usually be the ending of the conversation. Now everything has changed. in the last 6 to 8 months or so, artificial intelligence has changed the game. And I request that in this class, at least, you don't use artificial intelligence. I was going to say demand, actually. I guess I'm between request and demand. And I'll tell you why. There are multiple reasons why, and plagiarism is just a piece of it. I have grave concerns, personal grave concerns about artificial intelligence, the speed at which this is moving. We are seeing changes that normally take years occur in weeks. It's growing, in effect, exponentially. Certainly, the artificial intelligence I'm talking about now will not be the artificial intelligence that exists at the ending of the semester. I can't help but think of movies like The Terminator or Frankenstein. It's an old story, by the way, where an individual engages in some sort of scientific inquiry or technological advancement and is not necessarily cognizant of possible consequences, and the possible consequences are dire. Again, the speed at which this is moving definitely troubles me, especially because of the propensity that artificial intelligence has to do something that I've read called hallucinate. I believe this is called lying and other venues, which leads to a whole other can of worms about sentience and that I don't necessarily want to get into. But the idea is that artificial intelligence is giving wrong information at times. And it's not necessarily because there is a problem with the programming or there's an error with the algorithm. And I draw your attention to the notes below to a news article that I included that you may want to read. And I'll tell you briefly about it. It happened in the last several months. It was about an attorney who was using artificial intelligence to put together a court brief and actually queried artificial intelligence with getting the precedents of the court cases. Are these court cases valid? And was assured by the artificial intelligence that yes, these court cases are valid. So the lawyer submitted it. It turns out none of those courses existed. The artificial intelligence, for lack of a better word, hallucinated, lied. The attorney was caught. He was facing rather significant sanctions. His only defense is that he was lazy. He had been in law for several decades. There was no reason to do this outside of trying to save some time and some effort. And again, the consequences for him professionally can be rather dire. So that's the second reason that I have concerns about artificial intelligence. The third is about the possible impact of artificial intelligence on our society economically and socially. Again, I had talked about how rapidly things are changing, but artificial intelligence could could basically wipe out entire industries in a short amount of time. So if you've been following the Hollywood strike that's been going on now, then you know that part of the contention is about using artificial intelligence to replace the writers and to replace the musicians, even to replace the actors. And that artificial intelligence has gotten to the point that we really don't need actors. Artificial intelligence uses the data that already exists in the internet, so we can use the images of actors and singers, the art of artists, the writing of writers, and have it be computer generated. So this is definitely a point of contention in Hollywood, and I can understand why, because of what this would mean for entire industries. It also leads to questions of plagiarism and public domain if artificial intelligence is indeed being schooled, in effect, by the work of humans. Shouldn't those humans get some sort of credit or acknowledgement? So there are lots of different elements associated with artificial intelligence that I think are concerning. And if nothing else, artificial intelligence is using our input, our queries, and the information that we put on the internet in order to develop its responses. And I find that, again, rather unfair and also troubling. So all of those reasons and more, I'll get off my soapbox now. I'm well aware of the time that I'm almost 15 minutes into this class and we still haven't talked about the curriculum for today. All of those reasons and more is why I encourage you to not use artificial intelligence, at least in my class. Again, I don't want to be a fearmonger, and I certainly don't want to be a Luddite. It probably has its place. I'm just not sure where or how, and I suggest not in this class, especially as many of you indicated, that you're in this class to learn, to develop your skills, and the way to do that is to actually do the work yourself. So, moving forward, you can see in the notes below, our first speech is a 5-minute autobiographical speech. And that's going to be due on October 12th, 11:59 p.m. So we have some time to talk about how to put together speeches. And in terms of your autobiographical speech, you are going to tell the audience something about you and perhaps your life. There's a lot of different ways you could proceed. You could give a life overview. But remember, you have only 5 minutes, so you obviously are going to have to condense. Perhaps you want to focus on a particular time period or a particular element of your life, a person or a hobby. Just remember that the focus of the speech is not on the element or the person or the hobby. It's about you and how those things, the hobby for instance, help us understand who you are. For individuals who feel a little bit uncertain about self-disclosure, and you can decide how much or how little to self-disclose, the one element we all share is education. So you could decide to talk about an educational goal, or you could talk about your educational past, or if nothing else, you could devote a speech as to why you're taking this particular class at GCC. So there's lots of different ways you could proceed. As the semester progresses, I'll show you some sample speeches from students like yourself, in no way connected with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you'll end up being reviewed by a class. And we can use those as possible models. Since this is an online class, you obviously can't record your speech live. So what you're going to be doing is recording your speech, much like I'm recording these videos, uploading them onto Moodle. The best way to upload them is the way that I upload my class videos is through YouTube. And I'll share some instructions with you when you get a little bit closer to the actual due date. And as we will talk about, this is not a class in editing. The idea is not that you edit your speech so that you end up with the perfect speech. This is a one-shot only kind of deal, much like the way that I present these videos. That certainly if you begin and you wanted to start over, you could start over, but you certainly don't want to take bits and pieces from multiple videos and combine them together so that you end up with something that looks perfect because it looks like it's choppy and it's been edited. So we want to make this class as useful as possible for the real world, and in the real world, you're going to be on Zoom meetings. And you want to be able to present yourself in an articulate way. In a real world situation, you might have to do what I'm doing right now, recording yourself and sharing that in the workplace. So I want you to have some experience with being able to do that. And whether you were giving a speech live or recording it, there is no such thing as the perfect speech. The idea is that you want to be able to connect with your audience. And I understand that recording is a bit different. There is no audience. You are basically speaking to a camera. And I can tell you that when I first started to do this, it's a transition. So part of it is thinking of the camera as a person that you're making eye contact with, as we'll talk about as the semester progresses. So one thing I did want to talk about, because I'm aware that people are still adding and dropping, you may not have had a chance to get to the textbook yet. Note that the textbook is available on reserve in the GCC library. So today's class, what would have been ideal is that you would have done the readings that I had assigned ahead of time before viewing this particular video. But I understand that it may not have been possible. So what I wanted to talk about was something that was not in the reading. It's called Toastmasters. You may have heard of this organization below. Basically, it's an international organization now that helps its members improve their public speaking skills. And in the notes below in section 3, I've included their website if you wanted to find out more about them and look them up. And they basically have all kinds of local and national chapters. The reason why I'm mentioning Toastmasters specifically is because they came out with a training video that talks a little bit about the process of how to put together a speech. It's about 35 minutes long or so. And I wanted us to watch that video. If we were live, I would be showing it to you. But I was able to find, luckily, a link for it online. And so you can access that free link and watch that video. And basically, it's a quick review of what it is we'll be talking about this semester. In fact, what I recommend is that you stop my video now and you watch the Toastmasters video. And then you can go back to my video at minute 20, 30 or so. Welcome back. So it's a little bit after minute 20, 30. I'm in about minute 20, 36 right now in my video. And just to review what the Toastmasters video talked about informative speeches, which is actually a speech you'll be giving, the importance of being clear and concise because you're teaching your audience. The persuasive speech, which you will also be giving, and the importance of motivating your audience to take action or support a position. And oftentimes that involves in using emotion. We're emotional beings. And there also are speeches that are devoted to entertainment. You're not necessarily giving a speech of entertainment, but you are giving an autobiographical speech. And from my perspective, these are very entertaining to learn about the members of the class and to find out a little bit more about all of us, which is something that you may not be able to do in other disciplines. So using stories, using humor can be very useful. And in fact, these divisions are somewhat artificial. In fact, if we were to put together, let's say, an hour-long speech, and please don't panic, you won't be doing that, it would have autobiographical elements in it, probably. And it would also have informative elements in it. And it would also have persuasive elements in it. I've just divided up these skills into 3 separate speeches. Our first being autobiographical, 5-minute speech. That's what we're focused on now. But knowing that in the future there will be a 10-minute informative speech. And some students even like to piggy bank so that what they've talked about in the autobiographical, they can continue on with an informative and teach us about something. Not that you have to piggyback. And the third speech, the 15-minute persuasive. The video emphasized the importance of practice, as I do as well. Practice does make perfect. The more you practice, the more comfortable you are with the material. It talked about the importance of preparing, thinking about the logistics of the thing, the location. And for our purposes, it's going to be recording ourselves and posting it onto the Moodle site so that the second piece of this assignment, after everybody has posted their speeches, is for the entire class to watch their classmates' speeches. And I'm going to ask at that point for each of you to send me a strength and a weakness privately to my email for each of the speeches that you viewed of your classmates. I'll compile all of that information and then present that to you in a following class. But in addition to giving your own speech, you want to watch the speeches of others and you want to try to evaluate those as well. That's one of the ways that you can learn how to present and also learn how to be a good critical audience member. And also the objective of the speech. You might say that's pretty easy with the first speech, is that it's autobiographical. I've got to tell the class about myself. For my purposes, I'm also interested in the objective of our getting to know each other a little bit and putting into practice some of the public speaking skills that we will be learning. Then writing the speech. And one of the things we'll talk about is the importance of having good speaking notes. In fact, the speaking notes I use are the speaking notes you see below the video. I'm actually using paper, and I'll talk about the reasons why I print out those notes when we get to the section about talking about notes. But basically what's in front of me on the paper is what is below the video for you electronically, so that I can glance down briefly. Note, I'm not using complete sentences. I don't have too much text. Keywords and phrases, so that I can easily skim, so that I can maintain eye contact. But I do have something in front of me, like a map. In the event that I were to lose my place or my focus, I could look down. And then I could hopefully easily skim and find the information so that I could continue on. I have had some students say that they feel uncomfortable writing outlines this way. They're used to much more detailed outlines, which works very nicely, by the way, when you are writing a paper, because the more detailed, the better, but less useful when you're actually delivering a speech. If this happens to be you, you could actually write out an autobiographical paper, but then you need to reduce it to keywords and phrases so that you can deliver it. You can talk it out. And I've had students in English classes tell me that they're much more comfortable speaking rather than writing. And I tell them to record themselves speaking out a paper, transcribe it, and that's the draft of their paper. And then they can just polish it. So you can move in either direction if you so wanted to. Speeches are divided up into 3 pieces, just like papers. Introduction, which is where, for our purposes, we greet the audience. You want to say hello to the audience so that they know it's time to say, pay attention. This is also where you give your thesis. Again, any writer is familiar with the idea of thesis. This is your main point. And then you have something called a discussion section, or we oftentimes talk about this as the body of a paper. This is where you give your details and your evidence. And then you have something called a conclusion. And this is where you give your closure. You let your audience know that you're done. And for the purposes of a speech, this is where you give your farewell. Of course, because you're delivering a speech, you're not writing a paper. You need to think about the presentation. You want to be conversational, as if you are having a conversation with the camera or with your audience. You definitely want to be having a speaking outline that's readily accessible. You may not even look at this outline if you're very well prepared. But I liken it to the trapeze artist who would give a performance without a net. Not smart. Because the trapeze artist might fall, even though the trapeze has never fallen before. And I say it's the same thing with an outline. You want to have something in front of you. Things like eye contact, body language, vocal inflection, pauses, and trying to anticipate audience questions, because we're at a disadvantage here. We don't have an audience that can ask us questions. So the more questions we can anticipate and address, then the clearer the speech will be for the audience. The one thing I left out that is discussed in the Toastmasters video, and that's going to be our attendance question for today, which will be in our class discussion forum, is about nerves. And some of you already admitted to this when you were talking a little bit in your initial discussion forum response, when you were telling the class a little bit about yourself. Just about everybody feels nervous delivering a speech. That's quite normal, including those who give speeches professionally. The idea is not to eliminate nerves. The idea is how to manage nervousness. Because again, it helps bring about a heightened awareness. It means that it's an important activity. That's a good thing. But you don't want it to stand in the way. And the textbook gives you some suggestions on how to deal with nervousness. But even if you haven't had a chance to read the textbook, you could certainly answer today's attendance question, because my suspicion is that you've all dealt with nerves and nervousness in one way or another. So you might have your own techniques. So the question is, and this is at the bottom of our notes, but you can also go to the discussion forum. What suggestions do you have to control nervousness? You're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So we may as well deal with what I call the elephant in the room, nervousness. But before that, I had very hopefully assigned 3 chapters. And again, you may not necessarily have had a chance to read them, so you might be reading them after the fact. But the first was about speech in higher ed. The second was about getting started. The third was about critical listening. So I wanted to briefly talk about each of those 3 readings. So speech in higher ed, the chapter is basically devoted to trying to convince us why it's important to utilize public speaking skills. Some of you talked about this in your forum response last week, about the importance of this in the workplace and in your personal life, being able to communicate clearly with others. Now, this is a 101 class, which means that we are oftentimes introduced to technology or to phrasing that's associated with the actual discipline itself. So some of these phrases may be things that you know intuitively, but you didn't necessarily know that they had a particular terminology associated with it. The intellectual imperative, and you can see that I've indicated that in the notes below. It's just a fancy way of saying that as an educated person, somebody who has an intellectual background, is well-rounded and has knowledge of things like rhetoric, communication, public speaking, math, science, literature, art. And that's one of the reasons why public speaking is oftentimes a requirement when you are pursuing a degree. There's something called a social imperative, the idea that we are social beings and we interact with one another. Therefore, in order to be able to interact with one another, whether it be in school or the workplace or just personally, privately, we need to be able to present our thoughts in a clear and concise way. There also is a consumer imperative, which I've become even more interested in as time has progressed, that as audience members, we consume the speeches of others. We want to be able to evaluate those speeches critically. And critically doesn't mean being filled with criticism, but asking questions, analyzing, interpreting. And I always say that this is a difficult class to teach because we have to follow criteria, and yet we go into the, quote, real world, unquote. I'll take politics as an example. And those criteria aren't followed in public speaking. That speakers aren't necessarily clear or concise or even honest or ethical, which is something that we want to be. The first chapter talks about the importance of ethos, which sounds like ethics, that we want to have credibility and when we are presenting information. And I understand that that doesn't always happen outside of the classroom. And as consumers, in the consumer imperative, I say we should demand more. We should demand the same of our elected officials and other people who speak publicly as we demand of ourselves and our peers when we're in class. Now, public speaking is circular. Usually there's a speaker who gives a message, but it doesn't stop there. The audience responds to the speaker, gives feedback, and the speaker adjusts accordingly, within reason, of course. Again, we're at a disadvantage because we are filming, so you want to try to anticipate how an audience might respond. Though I have had students say that the camera feels so odd to them that they would feel more comfortable having a human being behind the camera. There isn't any reason why you couldn't ask a friend or a family member to be behind the camera. While you're looking at the camera, you're also looking at them. Of course, it looks like you're just looking at the camera lens. We can't see the others who are there. That might be a technique you might want to utilize as you become more comfortable with speaking to a camera. Again, there are pros and cons to speaking to a camera. The reality is that in our society, this is becoming more and more common. So you will get that benefit by taking the class online, even though you're not taking a class where public speaking is done in person. Of course, the benefit is that we do have to speak in person as well. So ideally, you would take both classes, both the in-person and the online, but it's one or another. This is the section that you're in, the online. The second chapter talks a little bit about getting started, which is where you are right now. You're starting to get started, thinking about that. What am I going to do with that autobiographical speech? Though in the back of your mind, you might be thinking about the informative and the persuasive as well. So you need to select a narrow topic. You know that the autobiographical speech is about you, but what specifically you talk about you. And the way the textbook talks about this in chapter 2, they give you a visual that looks like a staircase that I'm quite fond of because we're all at the bottom of the staircase and we're working our way up. So these are building blocks in effect. You have to determine the purpose of your speech. And again, the purpose for you might be to satisfy the requirement or to earn a good grade. The purpose for me is that we can get to know each other a little bit better and you can practice your public speaking skills. There might be other purposes as well. So you might be delivering a speech because you want to impress one of your classmates. And those are private purposes for yourself. Analyzing the audience and occasion. And you do have an advantage because you know who your audience is, your classmates and myself. And you also know the occasion. It's an academic setting. You want to be able to adapt accordingly for what's appropriate. So I wanted to share a little story with you. And this occurred to one of my colleagues at another institution. I won't tell you which. And it was a public speaking class. And the speech that the student was delivering was quite philosophical in nature, talking a little bit about being true to oneself. Well, what ended up happening during the speech, and this was a face-to-face class, is the student began to disrobe, believe it or not. And at first it was socks, shoes, belt, then it went to things like shirt, and then the beginning of the pants. The teacher stopped the speech at that point and asked just what the heck was going on, and the student responded that they wanted to show their true selves to the class, which seems like what the student was intending to do was to disrobe. That was their true self. Again, real story. So I'm fond of saying you can't make this stuff up. Might I suggest the student was not analyzing audience and occasion, that it would not be appropriate to do that in an academic setting? If you learn nothing else from this class, please don't disrobe when you're giving a public speech. I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but occasionally you hear news stories about a graduation, let's say, speech that's gone wrong, where a student has opened up their robes and they're nude underneath, and it becomes a media scandal for the school. Definitely you don't want to be there. So what happens after you analyze audience and occasion? You have to gather material, perhaps. Your first speech is about yourself, so I don't think you necessarily need to gather material because you already know about yourself. I did that deliberately. However, if you want to use this as an opportunity to learn more about your family history, you could interview family members or do some genealogical research. Certainly not required. Once we start talking about the informative and definitely the persuasive speech, you will have to gather information, gather material. So we'll talk more about that as the semester progresses. Making a speaking outline. There's a whole class devoted just to doing that. But you are looking literally at my speaking outline when you look at the outline below these videos. Practicing out loud. I even set aside time for all of us to have practice consultations with me. It could be as informal as you just sending me an email telling me what you're planning on doing your speech about, or it could actually be a Zoom meeting where you deliver your speech and I give you feedback, or something in between. That won't be happening until we actually get closer to the due date of the speech, but you'll be doing that with all three speeches because I do want to have some sort of connection with you, with your speeches. And then lastly, of course, delivering the speech. The third chapter that I had assigned was about listening, and I guess the summary of that chapter, I can give it to you in one sentence. We're really lousy listeners. Studies have shown some rather troubling truths about listening, that people will listen a very small amount of the time, mostly because they're preparing their responses. And there is a difference between hearing, which is processing sound, which is what most people can do, and listening, which is paying attention and processing the information and understanding it and thinking about it. And it's quite possible to hear but not to listen, which is what many of us do many times. In fact, there are specific reasons why we tend to be such poor listeners. So we're introduced to another piece of terminology that you may know of more informally as daydreaming, but the text talks about it as the internal perceptual field. We think more quickly than we can speak. So if someone is speaking to us, we're likely to daydream. One thought leads to another, and before you know it, you've lost a particular segment of what somebody has said. There's something also called the external perceptual field, and this is the environment. Things like noise and lighting and temperature. And sometimes you can manipulate this and sometimes you can't. Certainly you want to have enough lighting so that we can see you. And that's something that you can manipulate with a video. Hopefully, there isn't too much external noise. Again, that might be something you can manipulate with video that you might not be able to manipulate in a face-to-face class. If there's noise in the hallway, for instance, though you may be able to close the door to sort of block out that noise. In fact, the textbook is going to give you questions that you should ask yourself when you're listening to speeches. These are wonderful questions to ask yourself, too, when you are putting together a speech and delivering a speech. I've asked similar kinds of questions, and I've included that in our syllabus and other documents folder, or I will be including that. Actually, I think I already have included it, but I'll be talking about it later. It's the speech rating handout that I'm going to be using for your first speech. Basically, is a template of everything we'll be talking about over the next several classes, where you will be evaluated on things like introduction and body and conclusion and presentation and so forth. I don't even use the template for the second or the third speech. I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses and then share that with you. But that template is a good way to begin thinking about how to put together a speech. So we will be discussing that. It's also a good template about how to respond to the speeches of others. So we'll also talk about memory, which is related to listening. Our memory skills tend to be rather weak sometimes because, well, our memories are weak. How weak? Pretty darn weak. Studies have shown that we can remember just a handful of pieces of information. We'll talk a little bit more about that as the semester progresses and some of the techniques we can use to overcome some of those difficulties with memory. So what will we talk about next class? Chapter 7 about organizing and outlining. So there's a specific chapter devoted just to organizing. Chapter 8, beginning and ending speeches, and why the beginning and ending of a speech is so pivotal. And lastly, Chapter 9, wording a speech. How can you be conversational but also be precise as well? So what's left for today is, I'm assuming you've watched the Toastmasters video. So what's left for you is to answer today's discussion forum question, which will be due on Saturday the 16th. You have 48 hours in which to answer that question. Though certainly, if you need additional time, let me know, and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And the question is what suggestion or what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week talking about how to deliver speeches. Take care. Bye-bye.